think it's a variety of reasons for me. Uh, Definitely part of it is just that I've always perceived a lot of really deep inequalities in the world and had this kind of ongoing realization throughout my life of sort of more and more ways in which our political and our economic and our societal systems are all kind of structured to help the few at the expense of the many. And I'm a pretty radical humanist. I believe that all human beings should be equal, which I know is a crazy thing to believe in this day and age, but I really believe that. And so on some very fundamental level, this is just, it's a movement that appeared, and I saw it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the first thing in my lifetime that actually comes close to articulating what I've always felt. And so I knew I needed to be a part of it somehow. And then it kind of came about organically, this particular way to participate in changing the world, to participate in demanding equality, to participate in democracy, because the one thing that's really happened for me is the initial impetus to begin occupying was simply this sort of deep spiritual connection with all of humanity, and particularly with the people who are suffering. Because me myself, I don't feel the effects of a lot of the very serious problems that are going on in America and in the world. I mean, right now, over 20% of children in the United States of America are living in poverty, and that's, people seem not to care, but people do care. And I think it's really that people aren't aware, and that even when people are aware of some issues, they're not fully conscious of it. It hasn't sank in for them in a real way. And so for me, doing this has helped the truth of what's going on really sink in. And so as it's continued, I've really found more and more reasons to be doing it. And so it's actually become more and more difficult for me to answer this question. But that's sort of what started me into it, I guess.
Okay. So like through like many reasons that you just stated, like, so what exactly you want to achieve through Occupy Dartmouth?
I mean, I on the most basic level, I want to achieve the beginning of learning how to organize and affect real change in the world we live in. So I don't truly expect Occupy Dartmouth to create the ultimate goals that inspire me to Occupy Dartmouth, right? I think Occupy Dartmouth really is just about making people conscious of what's going on and kind of raising that consciousness and beginning to engage in dialogue, in convening as human beings in the world we live in for the purposes of naming that world. I mean, that's a Freudian ideal, but this idea that we need to come together and find a way to understand the world we live in before we can transform it. And I think we're still very much at that stage of naming the problem, of naming the forces that control our lives, the forces that kind of sit beneath the surface of all of the systems we live in, that inspire all of the different forms of oppression and violence that manifest in our lifetimes and across the globe. So I think for Occupy Dartmouth, there are a lot of little things I'd like to see happen. Like, I'd like to see the Board of Trustees become a lot more transparent. I'd like to see the conflicts of interest that seem evident in how this college is run resolved. I'd like to see the staff made a priority on this campus rather than treated as a commodity that's kind of the first thing to be sacrificed whenever we struggle. I'd like to see the people who are kind of benefiting from this academic industrial complex taking care of the people who keep their machine running. But really what I would like to see ultimately is a radical restructuring of our political systems, our economic systems, our living systems, our ecological systems. I mean, every single thing we do is broken, in my opinion. There's our relationships don't work right, especially here at Dartmouth. I mean, it's so rare to meet people in healthy romantic relationships at this school. You know, our way of relating to the world is broken. I mean, we treat the earth like it's this infinite source of shit we can just take, when actually we belong to the earth, and we should be worrying about taking care of our mother, not sort of stripping her bare of all of the resources she can provide us. You know, these, on every level, you know, the economic system is fundamentally unsustainable and fundamentally undemocratic. I mean, capitalism and democracy are mutually exclusive, because capitalism fundamentally lends itself to focusing power. It puts a premium on maximizing your progress at the expense of everyone else's progress, which means that you need to silence the voices of the many for the sake of the few for capitalism to work, in the sense that for the people who are succeeding in capitalism to continue to succeed, they feel the need, the very real need, to silence the voices of those who actually operate the machinery, in a metaphoric sense and in a very literal sense. And so I think, you know, on every level it's broken, and no one knows how to fix it, and no one will know how to fix it until we start actually engaging in the repair process, and that's what we're doing here.
So like, to what extent do you think like you achieved something from Occupy Dartmouth? Like, what have you been achieving so far?
I mean, the personal transformation is very real. I think that's the first achievement for me, is finding the permission finally to be the change I want to see in the world. To quote the time-honored Eleanor Roosevelt quote. So I think that's a huge part of it, is the personal transformation, realizing I can stand up, I can fight back. And I think we've also done something to the community at Dartmouth. People, whether or not they kind of try to ignore us, whether or not they support us, whether or not they actively oppose us, everyone is aware that we exist. And the very real danger at Dartmouth, and the tendency, is to ignore the existence of the most important things that are happening in the world, which is actually a tendency we see in the mainstream media too. You know, no one wants to talk about the violent oppression and suppression of the Palestinian people, because we as America are supposed to support Israel, and it's seen as unsupportive to point out the inequalities, to point out the violence, which is ridiculous. But the media is complacent in it, and we here at Dartmouth are super complacent in it. And the same is true with this movement. If we weren't occupying Dartmouth, a significantly smaller percentage of the Dartmouth population would be even aware of the movement. And it gives people the opportunity, if they choose, to break down their own assumptions about what this movement is, because the media is projecting a very twisted, very slanted corruption of what's really going on the ground. And Occupy Dartmouth offers an example of what these sort of attempts look like for people. And so they can actually see what it looks like for, you know, here, a very small group of people to attempt to engage in this truly democratic process of demanding our right to speak, of standing up against the forces that would see us silenced. And I think that what has happened is the crack has occurred in the dam, you know, and that first bit of water is starting to leak through, and that crack is going to continue to grow. And a lot of the powerful forces, the plutocrats, the people who dominate our capitalist society, are going to try and patch up those cracks and get rid of the movement, but it's not going to work. You know, the damage has been done to the machine, and it will only grow, this movement. It will only grow, and it will only evolve, and it will transform. And we're seeing this in New York already. People are saying, okay, you're not going to let us set up our tents? Good. I'm glad we can't camp anymore, because that means we have to directly act. We have to take this from the safe and relatively passive act of occupying space and saying, look at us, do something, to actually saying, okay, we're going to come into your space. We're going to step out of the parks and into the streets, step off of the streets and into the doors of the banks, and through the doors of the Wall Street executives, through the doors of the Capitol buildings, and into these systems that we now will occupy with our ideas, with our dialogue, with our signs, with our movement, you know? And this movement represents the vast majority of people on earth and in the country, and we are standing up for the right to exist of all mankind. And so, you know, the saying is, you can't evict an idea whose time has come, and that's true.
Yes, you talk a lot about occupying, you know, Wall Street. So I wonder, because I know that there are another group, like local group, like Occupy Vermont, right? Yeah. So I wonder, like, do you expect to make any impact on the actual Occupy, like, Wall Street, like a larger, like on the actual national protest, I guess?
Yes, I think, well, one, I think from here we go there, and you know, many of our members have been to Boston, have been to Occupy Wall Street, and so in that way there's a very real way in which we are interwoven with the rest of the Occupy movement, because our bodies are actually interwoven with their bodies. And though we may be kind of relegated to this, you know, dark corner of the world here in at Dartmouth in Hanover, New Hampshire, we are still part of this huge global movement, and we are dealing with the ideological questions that they are dealing with. And so when, you know, when I finally graduate and I can go join this movement in the larger spaces, in the bigger groups, I won't be coming into it out of nowhere. I'll be coming into it out of a unique set of experiences which will provide me with a unique perspective that I think will ultimately benefit the movement at large. And then I also think that it's, you know, it can't not help to do this, I guess is what I'm saying, you know, in that we may not be as well developed as our larger brothers and sisters in terms of movements and in terms of occupies, but trying to do this is extremely valuable for the people who engage in the attempt. It's extremely valuable for the people who observe us trying to engage in the attempt, in that we're breaking down walls, and everyone has these massive complexes of internal walls that they build inside themselves that allows them to not sort of be constantly outraged at everything they see, because the fact that everyone isn't constantly outraged at everything they see is a clear sign that people aren't really seeing the things around them. Because if you were, you would be infuriated, because it's morally bankrupt, it's entirely unsustainable, everything is broken. I've said it, you know, I'll say it again, but I think that we are actually subtly breaking down the internal walls of the co-inhabitants of this community, to the extent that perhaps when they go home over Thanksgiving break, they'll have already gotten past one or two things internally, and they'll be ready to ask that question, and they'll go to the Occupy in their home city that's much bigger, much more developed, thinking that they've got this criticism, and then maybe they'll realize, wow, this thing really makes sense. And maybe when they come back to Dartmouth, they'll still say, well, I think you guys aren't valid because you're not as far along as the Occupy in my home city, so now that's why I'm not supporting you. But what we're seeing is people are running out of excuses to not get behind changing the world and making it a better place. And we're part of that.
So what challenges have you been facing